The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, episode 32, The Bridge or the Wall When Connection Becomes Choice. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. If you've been journeying with us through this new arc, the relational series, mirrors, bridges, and boundaries, you know we're exploring the fragile and powerful spaces between self and other. Today's conversation asks a deceptively simple question. When someone approaches us, in love, in friendship, in conflict, do we build a bridge or do we raise a wall? Every encounter offers that choice. A bridge is risky. It requires openness, vulnerability, and a willingness to meet in the middle. A wall feels safer, strong, protective, and clear. But walls can quickly become prisons, and bridges, if built without care, can collapse under the weight of expectation. In this episode, we'll explore the subtle difference between healthy boundaries and avoidance, how my own experiences of building bridges and raising walls revealed what I was protecting, the psychology of connection and withdrawal, and why the decision isn't always as conscious as we think. Because the truth is, every act of connection is also an act of discernment, and learning when to reach out, when to retreat, and when to stand still may be one of the deepest skills of being human. So let's begin. Choosing the first step. When we meet another person, whether it's a stranger, a colleague, or someone close to us, there's often an unspoken question lingering beneath the surface. Do I step closer or do I step back? That first choice shapes everything that follows. A bridge begins with a single step forward. A wall begins with a step away. The challenge is that neither choice is inherently wrong. Sometimes a wall is necessary to keep harmful patterns at bay, to protect a tender part of ourselves, or to create distance from something overwhelming. Other times, a bridge is what allows life to expand, connection to deepen, and growth to occur. The real work lies in discerning which response truly serves us in the moment, and which is simply habit or fear disguised as protection. Themes and attributes, discernment, developing the awareness to notice what motivates your choice. Safety, fear, or genuine self-respect. Agency, owning that each encounter is a choice, even when it feels automatic. Intention, understanding that walls and bridges are not permanent structures, but tools that can be adapted. Courage, recognizing that both stepping forward and stepping back require bravery in different ways. Personal reflection, I recall a time when I met someone new who wanted to connect more deeply and quickly than I was ready for. Part of me felt drawn to the opportunity. There was curiosity, even a spark. But another part of me hesitated. I'd been burned before by opening too quickly, and the temptation to put up a wall was strong. At first, I convinced myself that avoiding them was just a boundary. In reality, it was fear. Eventually, I realized that what I needed wasn't to build a wall, nor to throw myself across a bridge I wasn't ready for. What I needed was to pause, to take one small step at a time, letting trust and comfort grow naturally. That experience taught me that the choice isn't always binary. Sometimes connection can be paced, a slow bridge built plank by plank, instead of all at once. Psychological insight psychologists often speak about the approach avoidance conflict. Lewin, 1935, the inner tension that arises when something both attracts and repels us. Relationships embody this paradox. We crave closeness, yet fear its risks. I felt this conflict most strongly in friendships. There have been times when someone showed genuine warmth and openness toward me, and part of me wanted to step forward. But another part of me pulled back, remembering moments where I'd been let down in the past. What looked on the surface like a boundary, saying I'm too busy or I'll catch up later, was on reflection more about avoiding the vulnerability of being seen. Attachment theory helps explain this. Someone with an avoidant leaning may retreat behind walls, even when connection is safe, while someone with an anxious leaning might rush to build bridges without checking the strength of the foundations. For me, noticing when I was defaulting to avoidance allowed me to pause and ask, is this choice really protecting me, or is it just protecting an old wound? This is where conscious discernment matters. A true boundary comes from clarity and values, not fear. Avoidance, on the other hand, can feel protective in the moment, but often leaves us more isolated than safe. Insight prompts. When faced with a new or deepening connection, what's your first instinct? To step closer or step back? Can you recall a time when you mistook avoidance for a boundary? What small signs help you know when it's safe to build or when it's wise to hold back? Theory in action. This week, notice your first instinct in one interaction, whether it's to lean in, lean out, or freeze. Before acting, pause and ask, is this coming from fear, from values, or genuine discernment? Try experimenting with a small conscious choice, such as a gentle step forward or a clearer expression of space. Over time, these little choices create bridges and walls that serve your growth. The architecture of bridges, every bridge we build is an act of intention. Unlike walls, which often rise quickly out of fear or habit, bridges require effort. They need foundations, support, and maintenance. And the truth is, sometimes it's easier to put up a wall than to do the work of spanning the distance. But the risk of avoiding bridges altogether is that life shrinks. We limit ourselves to what is familiar, to the people who feel safe, and to the patterns that don't challenge us. Bridges, on the other hand, open possibilities. They allow us to move toward understanding, to meet someone halfway, and to experience the growth that comes from difference. Themes and attributes effortful connection, recognizing that building a bridge requires active energy, not passive comfort. Reciprocity, a bridge must be supported on both sides to hold weight. Expansion, stepping beyond familiar ground into new perspectives and relationships. Maintenance, understanding that connection needs ongoing attention, not just a one-time effort. Personal reflection. There was a time when I worked alongside someone whose personality clashed with mine. My instinct was to step back to keep conversations polite but distant. It felt easier, safer. Something in me recognized that avoiding them wasn't serving either of us. So I made the conscious choice to try building a bridge. It started small, asking genuine questions, looking for common ground, and sharing parts of myself without oversharing. At first it felt awkward, even forced, but gradually something shifted. The bridge held. We didn't become best friends, but we moved from quiet tension to mutual respect. That experience reminded me that bridges aren't always about deep intimacy. Sometimes they are simply about creating enough connection to allow understanding and peace to exist where there was once division. Psychological insight social psychology highlights the contact hypothesis, Allport 1954, which suggests that under the right conditions, interaction between groups or individuals can reduce prejudice and conflict. Essentially, when we take steps to build bridges, particularly through shared goals or equal footing, we create opportunities for empathy and perspective taking. I've experienced this firsthand. When I resisted connection with that colleague, I reinforced the narrative in my mind that we were fundamentally different. But once I leaned in, however cautiously, I began to see layers I hadn't expected, their sense of humor, their work ethic, even struggles they carried quietly. It didn't erase our differences, but it softened the edges. The flip side is that bridges built on shaky ground don't hold. If reciprocity is absent, if one person invests while the other undermines, the effort can feel like carrying the full weight alone. That's where conscious choice matters. A bridge isn't worth building if the other side refuses to meet you. But where both are willing, even in small ways, the structure can transform the entire dynamic. Insight prompts. Where in your life have you avoided building a bridge because it felt too hard or uncomfortable? Is there someone you could meet halfway, even in a small way, to create more ease in your relationship? What signs tell you when a bridge is worth the effort, and when it isn't? Theory in action. This week, choose one situation where you feel a wall rising. Instead of pulling back completely, experiment with placing one plank of a bridge. That might mean asking a curious question, sharing a small truth, or offering a gesture of goodwill. Notice how the interaction shifts, even slightly, when you take a step toward connection instead of away from it. The seduction of walls are tempting because they promise certainty. They give us a sense of safety, control, and distance from discomfort. When someone hurts us, betrays our trust, or simply drains our energy, putting up a wall feels like the logical response. And sometimes it is necessary. But the seduction of walls is that they can become automatic. Instead of responding to each person or situation individually, we start treating them all the same. What began as protection slowly turns into avoidance, a refusal to risk vulnerability. Over time, those walls not only keep others out, they keep us locked in. Themes and attributes self-protection. Recognizing when walls are necessary to protect from harm. Avoidance versus boundary. Learning to tell the difference between a wall that isolates and a boundary that empowers. Emotional rigidity. Understanding how repeated withdrawal can calcify into a habit. Selective openness. Cultivating the ability to choose wisely when to let someone in. Personal reflection. There was a time when I found myself withdrawing completely from a social group after a conflict. It felt cleaner, simpler. I didn't have to justify myself, didn't have to face uncomfortable conversations. For a while, the wall gave me peace, but later I noticed the cost. By walking away without leaving any space for dialogue, I also cut myself off from the possibility of resolution. In hindsight, I realized that what I called a boundary was avoidance. A true boundary would have involved saying, "This behavior isn't okay with me, but I'm willing to stay in the relationship if it changes." Instead, I closed the door altogether. That experience taught me that sometimes walls disguise themselves as boundaries, and that clarity matters, both for myself and for others. Psychological insight psychologists often distinguish between avoidant coping and boundary setting. Avoidant coping involves withdrawing or disengaging from challenges to escape emotional discomfort, Holohan et al. 2005. Boundaries, on the other hand, are proactive and intentional. They define what we will and won't accept while still leaving the possibility for connection. My choice to walk away from that social group without explanation was a textbook example of avoidance. It spared me short-term discomfort, but it also prevented growth. Interestingly, research on conflict resolution shows that when individuals lean toward avoidance, unresolved issues tend to resurface in other contexts. Rosen et al. 2007. The wall I built didn't just separate me from those people, it followed me into future interactions, shaping how I responded elsewhere. This is why discernment is so important. Walls can be healing when used deliberately, but when they become habitual, they stunt the very growth we're seeking. Insight prompts. Can you think of a time when you mistook avoidance for a healthy boundary? What emotions drove that choice? Fear, exhaustion, or self-preservation? How might the outcome have changed if you had communicated your limits instead of withdrawing completely? Theory and action this week. When you feel the urge to pull back, pause and ask yourself, am I setting a boundary or am I avoiding discomfort? If it's a boundary, practice stating it clearly, even if just to yourself. If it's avoidance, consider whether a small step of communication could keep the door open without compromising your safety. Bridges of effort building, a bridge takes work. Unlike walls, which can be raised quickly in a moment of anger or fear, bridges require planning, patience, and persistence. They are acts of intention, built plank by plank, gesture by gesture. And the thing about bridges is, they don't guarantee who will cross. You can extend yourself, offer an opening, and still find that the other person isn't willing or isn't ready. That uncertainty is part of what makes bridges both beautiful and risky. Themes and attributes intentional effort, recognizing that bridges don't appear by accident. They're the result of sustained choices. Vulnerability in connection, accepting that reaching out doesn't guarantee reciprocation. That shared responsibility, understanding that one person cannot carry the entire weight of the bridge. Resilient openness, maintaining a willingness to build, even when past bridges have collapsed. Personal reflection. I remember a time when I had fallen out with someone I'd been close to. The rupture wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no betrayal, just a slow drift mixed with misunderstandings. It would have been easier to let the silence settle in, to treat the relationship as something that had simply run its course. But instead, I chose to reach out, not with a grand apology or a demand for clarity, but with a simple gesture, an invitation to meet. It felt awkward at first, like knocking on a door that might not open. Sitting across from each other, we began to talk. Not everything was resolved, but the bridge was there, fragile but real. That experience taught me something crucial. Bridges don't guarantee permanent repair, but they keep the possibility alive. Even if the connection doesn't return to what it once was, the act of reaching out often reveals something about the other person and yourself. Psychological insight relational psychologists often describe bridges as repair attempts. Gottman, 1994. In his research on couples, Dr. John Gottman observed that relationships aren't defined by the absence of conflict, but by the presence of efforts to repair after conflict occurs. This insight applies far beyond romantic partnerships. In friendships, families, and communities, the willingness to extend a hand after tension is often the strongest predictor of resilience. My choice to invite that person for coffee was a repair attempt. It didn't fix everything, but it created a space where mutual respect could still exist. Research suggests that even when repair attempts don't work, they reduce the long-term emotional residue of unresolved conflict. Fincham, 2000. In other words, the act of trying is itself healing because it affirms our capacity for openness and care. Insight prompts. When was the last time you built a bridge in a strained relationship? How did it feel to extend yourself without knowing how it would be received? What risks or fears hold you back from making repair attempts today? Theory and action. This week, think of one relationship where silence or distance has grown. Take one small step toward building a bridge, a message, a gesture, an invitation. Don't focus on the outcome, focus on the act of extending. Notice how the choice to reach out shifts you, regardless of whether the bridge is crossed. When walls speak louder than words, walls aren't always visible. Sometimes they're felt, the sudden silence, the avoided eye contact, the polite but distant responses. These subtle cues communicate something powerful. This far no further. The danger is that when walls become the default, they start doing all the talking for us. Instead of active choice, disconnection becomes a habit. Themes and attributes silent communication, recognizing the ways walls speak without words. Defensive withdrawal, understanding how avoidance masquerades as boundary setting. Habituation of distance, how repeated disconnection patterns can turn temporary walls into permanent structures. Self-protection versus self-exile, learning to notice when safety has become isolation. Personal reflection. There was a season in my life when I leaned heavily on avoidance as a strategy. On the surface, I told myself I was protecting my peace, but deep down, I knew I was simply retreating. Someone close to me tended to stir conflict, and instead of addressing it directly, I began to pull back. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left unread. I justified it as boundaries, but in reality it was avoidance. What I noticed, though, was how heavy it felt. Each ignored call carried a weight, not of freedom, but of unfinished business. The wall I built protected me from immediate conflict, but it also stopped any chance of growth, clarity, or healing. Eventually, I had to face that truth. What I called a boundary was actually silence doing my talking for me. Psychological insight psychologists often distinguish between boundaries and avoidance. Boundaries are clear, proactive, and communicated. Avoidance is reactive, vague, and silent. Hayes, 1999. While boundaries affirm self-respect, avoidance often arises from fear of confrontation. The tricky part is that avoidance can feel like strength. It offers short-term relief from discomfort, but research in acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, shows that chronic avoidance leads to long-term emotional entanglement. Hayes, Strosahl, and Wilson, 1999. My period of retreat illustrated this. By refusing to engage, I thought I was moving away from conflict, but internally, the unresolved tension remained. It was only when I re-engaged, clarifying what I could and could not accept, that the heaviness began to lift. That moment reinforced a hard truth. Silence is not always neutral. Sometimes it's the loudest wall we build. Insight prompts. Where in your life are you mistaking avoidance for a healthy boundary? What conversations remain unfinished because a wall is speaking for you? How might clarity feel lighter than silence? Theory and action. Choose one relationship where avoidance has replaced communication. Practice turning the wall into a doorway by articulating one clear boundary. For example, instead of silence after a hurtful comment, try, I value our connection, but I need us to avoid jokes about that topic if we're to stay close. Notice how clear communication reduces the emotional weight that silence carries. The healing bridge, not every bridge is easy to build. Some require more time, more patience, and more effort than we think we have. But in relationships, the act of building, of choosing to reach out even after rupture, can become one of the most healing experiences. Bridges don't erase the wall, they offer a way across it. Themes and attributes repair over rupture, learning to prioritize restoration rather than permanent withdrawal. Courage to reconnect, recognizing the risk and reward of reaching out after conflict. Mutual willingness, understanding that bridges require effort from both sides. Transformation through effort, how repair can create stronger connections than before the break. Personal reflection, there was a time when a long friendship of mine fractured over something that in hindsight was more about pride than principle. We both felt unheard, both dug our heels in, and the distance grew. Months passed. The silence between us became the wall neither of us wanted to admit we'd built. Eventually, I realized the wall was costing me more than the conflict itself. I missed the friendship, the shared history, the way we could speak without pretense. So I took the risk of reaching out, not with a grand gesture, but a simple message. I know things ended badly. I don't want to lose what we had. Can we talk? It wasn't instant repair, but that message became the first plank of the bridge. And as we spoke, awkwardly, cautiously at first, I saw something shift. The process of rebuilding made the friendship stronger, more intentional, because now it was carried not by assumption, but by choice. Psychological insight psychologist John Gottman's research on relationships emphasizes the power of repair attempts, small gestures, words, or actions that signal a willingness to bridge conflict. Gottman and Silver, 1999. Successful relationships are not defined by the absence of rupture, but by the ability to repair after rupture. In my own experience, I recognized how repair required vulnerability. Reaching out risked rejection, yet that very act of courage allowed both of us to step into honesty. Gottman's work highlights that repair attempts are often less about perfect phrasing and more about timing and sincerity. My message wasn't polished, but it was genuine, and that mattered more than eloquence. What I learned is that healing bridges are less about erasing the past and more about creating a pathway forward. The wall doesn't disappear, it becomes a reminder of where the bridge needed to be built. And sometimes that bridge becomes the strongest part of the relationship's architecture. Insight prompts. Who in your life have you drifted from, not because of harm, but because of pride or misunderstanding? What small repair attempt could you risk making, even if it feels uncomfortable? How might vulnerability be the material that strengthens the bridge? Theory and action. This week, choose one fractured connection. It doesn't have to be the hardest or deepest, and make a small repair attempt. This could be a message, a question, or even a shared memory. Focus less on the outcome and more on the act of reaching out. Notice how the effort itself reshapes your sense of connection, even if the bridge isn't fully built. Choosing your path, bridge, wall, or doorway every encounter asks us to choose. Do we extend a bridge, raise a wall, or open a doorway that allows others to step in at their own pace? The choice is never one size fits all. It depends on who stands before us, what we need to protect, and how much of ourselves we're willing to risk. Themes and attributes discernment in connection, knowing when to engage, when to protect, and when to offer space. Self-respect, making choices that honor your well-being without guilt. Mutuality, recognizing that not every connection is yours to sustain. It requires effort from both sides. Evolving choices, understanding that bridges, walls, and doorways can change over time. Personal reflection. There was a point in my life where I felt torn between protecting myself and staying open to others. I was rebuilding after a period of change, and people from different stages of my life started reappearing. Some wanted genuine reconnection, while others seemed more interested in what I could offer them. I realized I didn't have to make the same choice every time. With some, I built bridges carefully. With others, I recognized the need for a wall, not out of bitterness, but because engaging would only reopen old wounds. And in a few cases, I left the door ajar, allowing someone the option to step back in, but not forcing myself to hold it open indefinitely. That shift gave me clarity. I wasn't shutting people out or letting everyone in. I was choosing, moment by moment, what honored both them and me. Psychological Insight psychologist Nancy McWilliams, 2011, writes about the importance of ego boundaries, the ability to define the self in relation to others without dissolving into them. In healthy relationships, these boundaries are flexible, allowing us to engage, protect, or step back as needed. Too rigid, and we isolate; too porous, and we lose ourselves. In my own journey, I noticed how discernment became the key. When I defaulted to either always build a bridge or always build a wall, I lost balance. By allowing myself the option of a doorway, a space that signals openness without obligation, I found a middle ground. It reminded me that connection doesn't have to be absolute. It can be conditional on respect, reciprocity, and timing. Ultimately, the choice between bridge, wall, or doorway is about self trust. Trusting that you know what you need in a given moment and that your worth is not measured by how much access you grant others. Insight prompts. Where in your life are you defaulting to only one option, bridge, wall, or doorway? How might offering yourself more flexibility change the quality of your connections? What does self trust look like in your decision making around relationships? Theory in action this week. Try naming your relational choices as they arise. When someone seeks connection, pause and ask yourself, is this a bridge moment, a wall moment, or a doorway moment? Notice how simply naming the choice brings more clarity and intention to how you engage. The bridge or the wall, every encounter offers a threshold, a chance to step forward or step back, to build a bridge or to raise a wall. Sometimes the wall is what protects us, and sometimes the bridge is what saves us. The work is in learning to tell the difference, not out of fear, but out of honesty with ourselves. Not every connection is meant to be crossed, and not every boundary means disconnection. When you can stand secure in your own ground, you can choose freely, reaching out where it brings life and stepping back where it preserves peace. You've been listening to The Unfiltered Human on The Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and trust the choices that keep you whole. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse. A journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 the simulated self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 the spell of the mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 conscious seduction, journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within traces food, frequency, and the forgotten intelligence of the body. Episode 20 Encoded flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.